All right, welcome everybody. It is Thursday, August 20th, 2020, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and as you can see, I've got a new camera. Hopefully it's a little bit better quality. I'm going to keep upgrading my rig over the next couple weeks here, hoping to give you more of a professional HD quality stream. And I'm also traveling, so you could see been a little bit of a new locale. Don't get used to it. I'm not going to be traveling every week. If you guys really clamor for that, I will go ahead and do that and record the show at a different locale every week. But I don't think you're really going to care. So yeah, looks a little bit different today, and expect some upgrades coming in the near future. So I'm going to be doing a solo show again this week. We're working on guests again. Got some really good things in the pipeline, close to negotiating some conversations that I think will be very insightful and awesome for you guys to hear. But again, just because of different delays with work schedules, nothing else this week. So we've still got a lot to cover. So I'm going to be diving right into the subjects here. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoy. So first off, let's go ahead and talk about Jon Jones and the circus on Twitter that happened recently this week. So for those of you that have missed it, Jon Jones has vacated the light heavyweight belt. That will now be determined in a fight between Dominic Reyes and Jan Blachowicz. I forget the exact pay-per-view that it's scheduled for, but that's going to be for the undisputed light heavyweight belt. For the first time in, I believe, 11 years, we're going to have a new champion not named Jon Jones or Daniel Cormier. So that's kind of exciting. It's pretty crazy. But Jon took to Twitter and said that he couldn't come to negotiations with the UFC. So he's vacating the belt. He's going to pursue other things, wished everyone well, all of that, and essentially made it sound like he was retiring. As it turns out, 20 minutes later, he got back on Twitter and said, hey, had a great conversation with the UFC, and I'm going to be moving up to heavyweight. So look for that to happen. So what exactly happened here? Well, a couple of things. So for those of you that, again, haven't been following the Jon Jones saga in recent months, he's been pretty outspoken about not getting paid what he believed is fair, especially when it comes to facing contenders like Jan Blachowicz or a rematch with Reyes that he kind of deems not beneath him per se, but doesn't see much reward in terms of adding to his legacy for either fight. And he's been defending the belt for, when he hasn't had legal issues or USADA issues, has been defending the belt pretty much nonstop, undefeated in the octagon. So when you're looking at this whole situation, from Jon's point of view, it doesn't make sense for him to not get compensated fairly because, again, if he goes out and he beats Reyes again, or he beats Blachowicz, 3 or 4 years down the line, when somebody's looking over his resume, they're not going to look at that and say, oh, wow, he just, went through killers upon killers. I mean, it could be if Reyes ends up being a really dominant champion or Blachowicz and ends up looking amazing, that could be the case, but it's most likely not going to happen for him. So with this fighter pay issue that we've seen also in other cases with Masvidal and other people like that, he's feels that he hasn't been compensated fairly for his past title fights, and at this point feels like it's not worth it. So what happens within the 20 minutes of him saying all that to where he said, I had a great combo with the UFC, I'm moving up to heavyweight? Well, as much as people love to say, champ status is a great thing for the brand, it's a great thing for the promotion as well as the fighter, it enables these super fights that just brings in tons of money. That's not always the case. So a couple of things about champ status that's happened with now Daniel Cormier, Conor McGregor, Amanda Nunes. Almost happened with Dillashaw, but he couldn't get it done. There are others who have failed as well, but those are the three names that come to mind when you think of champs, obviously, for the UFC. When you're looking at that, remember that that's holding up two divisions because it's one person defending two belts. So if they're going to actually defend both belts, that means that the UFC can't book as many pay-per-views as they may like. If you've paid attention to the UFC's booking schedule, I think the only time where it's been scheduled since in 2016, where the main event was not a title fight was Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz 2. Other than that, it's always had a scheduled title fight in the main event. I know there's situations like UFC 234 where Anderson Silva and Israel Adesanya got bumped up because Robert Whittaker fell out last minute. Things like that have happened. But for the most part, they always book title fights in the main event. Whether that's because they've got their own metrics and research that say, hey, title fights make way more money in terms of the casual viewer buying a pay-per-view, or it's some contractual obligations they have either with their broadcast partner, ESPN, or the fighters, because generally fighters sign a contract and then have a championship clause in that contract that is activated when they first become champion. They then go on to subsequently sign championship-esque contracts, but there's no telling what that language exactly says. It's a little bit of an X factor there. Same with the broadcast partnership. It's very possible ESPN said, hey, we need you to have title fights in all your main events. And if you don't, you need to sign off with us first, and there has to be a legitimate reason, yada, yada, yada. It's really hard to say. But either way, if you take away one belt, because let's say DC is going to defend both the light heavyweight and heavyweight belts, for your scheduling, that really messes things up. Because remember, the UFC is also, in general, I know we're in crazy times because of the pandemic, but in general is booking out their schedule usually a quarter or two ahead at the time, and they're negotiating pretty much all year to get the venues lined up, to make sure they have title fights in place, to make sure everybody gets their fulfilled number of fights on their contract, because they have to offer so many fights per to a fighter per contract term. So they've got to, kind of do the math to situate everything like, oh, okay, I'm fulfilling my obligation from a promotional standpoint of offering these fights to fighters, and I also need headliners to be pay-per-view. That's a lot of logistics, and especially with matchmaking with Sean Shelby and Mick Maynard, that's a lot of logistics to coordinate all at one time. So when you have someone that is a double champion that insists on defending both belts, it causes kind of a headache for the promotion. Yes, it was good for Conor McGregor. It elevated the sport, brought more eyes to the UFC, probably arguably than anything else. It was good for Nunes. It brought legitimacy to her title reigns. Fighting Cyborg, that fight, and beating Cyborg, great for the women's division, great for Amanda Nunes, great for the brand. DC didn't work out, I don't think, the way they wanted it to, not even because he lost to Stipe the following two times, but simply because the pay-per-view buys for their original super fight, UFC 226, were in the 200, 300 range. So nothing, not outside of, and that's 1,000, by the way, 200, 300,000 range. Not, a record-shattering pay-per-view or even a Jon Jones-esque pay-per-view under normal circumstances of 700K, things like that. So that didn't really, work for them the way they wanted. And he eventually had to drop the light heavyweight belt so he could rematch Stipe after defending the heavyweight belt against Derek Lewis. So it really becomes a pain for the promotion from a logistics standpoint and from a risk-reward standpoint, right? If Jon Jones is a 2-weight champion, DC is a 2-weight champion, it doesn't matter who, and is injured, it sets up, injured at any point, it sets up this scenario where, yes, you can have someone fight for either the interim belt, or you could say it's the undisputed, make that person drop the belt. But it's in the eyes of the fans and the eyes of the media, they're always going to be, well, are they really the champ? Yes. Look at a great example is the situation with Dustin Poirier and Max Holloway, right? Dustin beats Max, wins the interim lightweight championship. As much as people were, saying, yeah, Dustin's finally got a belt and all that, there were a lot of people saying, well, he hasn't beaten Khabib, he hasn't beaten Khabib. So is he really the champ? And, that's not taking anything away from Dustin or his run. It was phenomenal. But from a marketing and brand standpoint, putting that interim there, even though it helps, it also doesn't give the same feel as this person is now the undisputed belt holder. So it's kind of a risk for the promotion, unless Jones is going to go on a tear and fight constantly, defend both belts constantly, and that can elevate him even more And honestly, it's going to be hard for him to do that because he's already been in the public eye for the UFC for so long. That's, he's kind of a mature star, right? If you're looking at this from a star standpoint, this isn't a new up and comer this isn't Israel Adesanya, who has stormed the scene, has won the middleweight belt, is defending it, did it in such a speedy fashion, and is a new face that if he goes up to light heavyweight and wins, he's 2-belt holder, they can ride that fame. And they can, that really elevates the brand. This is someone that's been around for a long time. And while they can get a small boost from it, we're not talking the same exponential growth that a new face would do at this point, because Jon Jones has been around for so long and because some of his past history. So from a risk standpoint for the UFC, it probably didn't make sense for them to compensate Jones as much for a move up to heavyweight as it did with the belt than it did without. Because now they get to free up that belt. They get to schedule a light heavyweight undisputed title fight, and that takes care of a pay-per-view main event or co-main if they want to add it onto some of these super cards. But either way, takes care of that end. And then, it's still now arguably the greatest of all time, fighting for a belt, pound for pound greatest of all time, fighting for a belt in a new weight class and a new challenger in not only a new weight class, a weight class that's really devoid of a lot of contenders. You have Curtis Blades, but he's lost twice to Francis Ngannou. You have Derek Lewis, but he's not too long ago got knocked out by Junior Dos Santos, and he's had some struggles when you hit that upper tier of the division. Then you have Francis Ngannou, who has roared back since his loss against Stipe, and Derek Lewis, which was, we all remember that fight. That rematch, should it happen, I think would go very differently. But either way, he's really the only clear-cut, okay, this is a contender at heavyweight. This is someone who makes a lot of sense for Stipe right now. So other than that, you're kind of left with a lot of people who are older, wins and losses, named staples of the division. But again, they've been around forever and they've kind of had middling records. They haven't been able to break into a contendership. So adding Jones in there adds new lifeblood, is a big name, gets eyes on the heavyweight division at a time when now Stipe is being viewed as the heavyweight greatest of all time because of his run and being able to beat DC twice. So that kind of sets up some more mystique and gives the heavyweight division more life, without any of the risk of, he's got to go back down and defend his light heavyweight belt, or, if he gets injured, we not only do we lose a title fight at heavyweight, we lose a title fight at light heavyweight. Makes more sense for them to be willing to compensate Jones a little bit more because their risk is now reduced. When their risk is higher, they're always going to use that as leverage and say, hey, we can't really do this because you've got the light heavyweight belt. I'm sure that was brought up in negotiations that said, hey, you've got the light heavyweight belt. We need to pay you a little bit less because what if you get injured, all of that. Now they can't fall back on that leverage. So that's pretty much what happened and what I believe to have happened in those negotiations. I think that I think this is going to be the end of the era of the double champ. You may see it in some of these lighter divisions. If Garbrandt goes down and beats Figueiredo, maybe he goes back up and challenges for the bantamweight belt. I could see them trying to push that with Nunes and the state of women's featherweight. Unless they start signing women's featherweights, I think you'll have double champs in that arena. But for the most part, I think this is the end of the double champ era. I think this kind of signifies that, the fact that suddenly within 20 minutes of dropping the light heavyweight belt, Jones gets a productive conversation with the UFC done. And I think that it goes to show again, UFC is always managing their risk reward ratios. It's always about the numbers. Nothing else really changed, at least in the public perception, unless something crazy happened behind the scenes we don't know about. Nothing really changed in those 20 minutes of I can't come to negotiations to we've got a potential deal done, other than Jones dropping the belt. So I think that in itself tells a lot. I don't think it's so much, we got to keep Jones here because he wouldn't have been able to fight anywhere else regardless, because of the way the contracts work. So I think that's pretty much what you're seeing here and why Jones is now fighting at heavyweight and why the UFC made the deal that it did. All right. So in other news, big news out today. From first reported by Bloomberg, also covered by MMApayout.com. So shout out to Jason Cruz for his work there, because that's where I actually saw this first. DAZN is reportedly looking to go public. Now that's huge news. Here's why. So for those of you that have DAZN, don't have DAZN, I know everyone knows of it at this point, especially with the relationship with Bellator, with boxing, signing Canelo. Their whole strategy to get into the space was they were backed by a billionaire, Len Blavatnik. I think I'm saying that right. Might not be, but either way, they were backed by a billionaire to kind of challenge ESPN and some other sports services, streaming sports services, Fox, things of that nature, ideally with the goal of eventually acquiring NFL, MLB, major American sports rights. That was the whole goal of this, really. Is they came onto the scene about 4 or 5 years ago, and they were looking to bring all of that into streaming and through a subscription service rather than the traditional television networks. They had started by getting a lot of soccer and football, or European football, quote unquote, rights for Europe and some other places. They have some broadcast distribution rights of American sports in Europe specifically, but their whole plan here was to come in, really take a foothold with boxing and combat sports, specifically boxing. They did pick up KSW, I believe, for a bit, and Bellator, obviously, but the main focus on combat sports was boxing. Obviously, you had that massive $365 million contract with Canelo and some other stars, Triple G, things of that nature. So you basically were looking at a company that was trying to come in, get a foothold with combat sports, and then once the rights were up for NFL, for MLB, for NBA, they were going to bid hard to get those exclusive rights. And then that would just carry their streaming service to another level. So it was basically, hey, let's get a foothold with combat sports and some other, lesser known American sports, but popular in Europe, things of that nature. Let's get subscribers. Let's build up a base foundation to get us some revenue going. And then once we've got that revenue, we're going to go ahead and, compete and bid for these rights that can be, the most expensive television rights for sports, essentially, is the NFL, NHL, NBA, MLB, all of that. So that was the plan. What was reported at the end of last year was they had these financial projections internally that were saying, we were going to hit these marks. We were going to prove we could grow our subscriber base and our revenue base using combat sports as an example and as a, business case, essentially, of, hey, this will work. We will be able to get these other rights. It will take off. And that was what this billionaire, Blavatnik, said, okay, yeah, I'm about it. I will fund you. And it was basically being funded mostly through him. He had some debtors in there and some other investors, but it was essentially him funding this all. And at the end of last year, a report was released where essentially those internal financials were way off. They did not hit the mark by any sort of measure. It caused Blavatnik, the main investor, to essentially say, you know what, I don't really want to put any more money into this. It's not where it needs to be. And that caused a scramble of trying to raise money through capital, whether that be private investors or through other debt instruments and partnerships, raise the capital to get their coffers filled so that when those major TV rights came due, DAZN would be able to compete with them. Now, that was around the time right before the pandemic hit, is where the report was released that they're looking for about, I believe the initial was $500 million in capital, and trying to do a fundraising round through that. Then the pandemic hits and kind of just, shut sports down. That was really bad for DAZN. They got a lot of flack because they didn't let people cancel. They just essentially said, hey, we'll give you so many months free of the service because of what's going on. But you couldn't cancel the service. You couldn't get the money back, couldn't get refunded. There were certain rules and stipulations depending on the type of contract you had, but that was kind of a big deal. So they weren't giving out refunds. They got flack for that. They were there were reports throughout the pandemic that they were just in really rough financial shape. So it looks like what this move is now is to raise that capital through public offering, which a lot of companies have done. You can look at some companies like Lyft and Uber, where they weren't making any money. They needed to raise capital. Hey, IPO, let's sell stock and get people to buy this. Because people look at those services and say, oh, I know Lyft, I know Uber, I'm going to buy it. And, despite the fact that they've never turned a profit, think, they will eventually. So I'm going to go ahead and get in on the ground floor. So when this stock is $1,000, I bought it at $20 a share. I'm going to be rich eventually. It's part of the mindset. Not everybody's mindset, but you get the idea. So it looks like what they're trying to do is do a capital offering through an IPO, and they're looking to raise $1 billion in capital, which is a lot. That's double what they were looking for earlier this year. It sounds like they didn't get many people in the VC or private investing world, venture capitalist world of taking bites through fundraising, because I would imagine even with the losses or issues they've sustained in the pandemic, if they had received some capital in those fundraising rounds, they wouldn't be looking for double of what was originally reported. So sounds like they didn't get much at all. Sounds like this is kind of their, I wouldn't call it a Hail Mary necessarily, but it could be, just in the sense of, if they go for a public offering and it just craters and Wall Street doesn't have the appetite for it, I don't know how they're going to be able to bid on these major rights. Could they stay in business without the major rights? Hypothetically, but I mean, they're looking at various problems because of these crazy contracts that they've had with Canelo and other boxing superstars, where they paid out, they paid out money that nobody had ever seen before in order to get Canelo on board and some of these other boxing guys. It's not profitable for them to do that and then not go after these bigger sports that would actually generate the revenue to sustain those contracts. Combat sports and soccer are not going to pay the bills when it comes to satisfying those contracts and giving them profit and revenue. So I think they know that. I think this is kind of a Hail Mary in that sense, because if they miss out on the major sports rights and they can't compete, they could look at downsizing some of their major contracts, keeping some of the promotions that they have in combat sports and in soccer on, and trying to go to a smaller business model. But that really kills what their whole strategy has been since inception. So I don't see it personally. I think they would be in big trouble if they weren't able to get anything in terms of even even a sport that, even some major soccer rights would be big, right? Just because it would help booster their revenue line a little bit. But it does seem that if they go through the next bidding rights season with NFL, NBA, all of those, and they're unable to come away with anything, that's kind of a death knell for the service. It really doesn't make sense for them to stay in business without that. You could, but I don't see it personally. I think it would end up being sold off, bought maybe into under a larger umbrella, and kind of shrink especially from where it is now, paying out these outrageous sums. So with that all being said, I think this is huge news, because if DAZN does go for initial public offering and it fails, that in itself might be the death knell of the service. Because if you're going to go for an IPO, I mean, something you have to remember with an IPO, you say, hey, we're going to sell it at this share price and give away equity. If the market deems that share price to be too high, we saw this with Endeavor, where they ended up pulling their IPO because Wall Street had no appetite for it. And then the price goes down, as it has with a lot of these IPOs that haven't been profitable upfront, whether you're looking at WeWork, Peloton, Endeavor before it got pulled, things of that nature, that severely cripples your business. So it's looking pretty dire for DAZN right now. We'll see if they actually go with the IPO. Otherwise, they're going to need a major investor to step in or some type of crazy partnership to pull this off and have enough money to bid on these major sports rights. But this is a big deal because if you see DAZN stock follow that price just for the first 2 weeks, even just look at that price first 2 weeks. Because if it's going to fail, it's going to fail fast. If it stays steady or goes up, okay, then that might be a sign of, hey, we can turn to the general public to get our shares higher and to have them raise capital through equity. We can do that. If I had to make a prediction, I'm going to go the latter, though. Next topic I want to dive into is something that Dana White said recently in an interview, talking about Contender Series and needing to cut other fighters because they're bringing in so many new people off Contender Series. Is he just talking? Maybe, but truth is he's offering a lot of contracts since Contender Series has ramped back up. You know, you've had a couple shows where pretty much everyone's getting contracts or near everyone's getting contracts. And as those people come in, you have to, again, as he alluded to, and as we know from other fighter contracts that have been revealed from the UFC antitrust lawsuit or other situations, you have to offer so many bouts to a fighter once they're under contract. Otherwise, the promotion has to pay them a penalty for not offering them so many bouts. They're in breach of contract, a whole bunch of stuff. So essentially what Dana was saying in this post Dana White Contender Series interview is, oh, well, you know, as we bring in these new guys, we're going to have to cut other guys to trim the fat, so to speak. It's a common practice that happens in business, especially if you can get employees or contractors at a lower rate. You know, it's something I've seen for I think every company I've worked for in my consulting realm, where I've seen, you know, somebody that's been there 8 or 9 years and is kind of a staple isn't gonna necessarily move up into management or go on the executive track, but has earned raises, has earned a couple of promotions over the years, and is maybe in middle management, maybe like a team lead, something that's not too hard to replace. One step above front line or on the front line. That's the most common where you see this, is somebody that's like, nope, I'm good in the position that I've been in for the past 8 years. I've gotten some raises. I've gotten some experience. I'm solid. When that happens, when you've got somebody who is now making 10, 20 grand from what they used to annually, but they're still in a frontline position, whether that's a, you know, software developer, whether that's a customer service rep, whether that's what have you, the business in a downturn, which I want to make it clear, yes, the UFC is very profitable still, but the pandemic is still cutting away their gate. It's still messing with their pay-per-view revenue in a good way, honestly. So you can't really say that that's the situation. But I mean, production costs, right? You're not making anything from gate. That does start to add up. It's a very small percentage, but still, given the UFC's business model of how debt leveraged they are and their plans of where they want to maintain this growth so they can get more investors. Again, as I've said before, I think eventually they'll go public. They want to show year-over-year growth as much as they can. And they want to show continued growth to get more investors into the company, especially Endeavor wants to, as I mentioned before, where they tried to go public. If they're going public with UFC under their umbrella, they want that to be solid right now because all of their other businesses are hurting. So they want to keep this strong growth that the UFC has seen over the past 10 years, especially in the past 5 years since they were bought by Endeavor. And that means, you know, trimming the fat, so to speak, in a downturn. And in these situations, anytime I've seen a recession or I've seen like the pandemic, the first to go are usually people who are experienced, but in a role that can be replaced by someone newer or at a much cheaper cost. I've seen several software developers get cut that were great at their job, you know, 3 to 5 years experience, had gotten some raises, came into the company when market prices were higher in general. So they were able to negotiate a better salary off the bat and then got some raises. They're now getting let go and being replaced with people that they can pay 20, 30% less easily. Companies will take advantage of that, even if they're not hurting terribly financially. This is the time when, hey, it's a, you know, it is a company market. You've got a flood of unemployment out there. You've got tons of people looking for work. I can get cheaper labor. I'm going to go ahead and cut some of these guys that have been here that do good work, but are higher priced than I'd like, and hire a replacement that may take 3 months, 4 months to learn the ropes. But, I'm going to be able to save 20, 30% of their annual salary, and that adds up. Same with fighters, same type of thing. These fighters are going to come in on, the entry-level contracts. They're going to be on the entry-level contracts for at least 3 or 4 fights. If they become a star or seem to have some momentum behind them, aka Sean O'Malley situation, something like that, you're going to see that jump. But for the most part, they're still going to come in on these lower rates, and it's going to take them a while to get up to a rate of maybe a journeyman who's been around for a while and might be 3-1 in his last 4, but he lost his last one, and he's not going to fight for a title. He's kind of a gatekeeper somewhere around that range. Evan Dunham, he's been around in the lightweight division for who knows how long. Betch Correia, same type of thing. Been around forever. Those aren't 3-1 people, but you get the gist of it. If they're middling, it looks like they're not going to excel the ladder any higher. They want to cut that fat. They want to, take some of these 50, 60 to show a win. So you're looking at $120,000 if somebody wins, and get that down to, 12 and 12. That's a $100,000 cost with one fighter. That's what they're going to continue to do. White wasn't shy about it. I don't think he necessarily needs to be, because, again, it's an employer's market right now. What's happening in the rest of the world is also, eligible for him. He's able to, the regional and feeder leagues. LFA has now just started back up. You're looking at Titan FC getting back into the swing of thing, but regional leagues, especially, most of them are still shut down. And I'm talking, I'm talking HRMMA. I'm talking, these smaller promotions that you're only going to see where maybe they have some name value, but they're not, they're not at the feeder league level of LFA or Titan. They're not on Fight Pass. They don't have those deals, but they're still important in a fighter's career and development growth. He's just bypassing them, because you're going to have people ready to step up that maybe, okay, we were going to wait to offer them something. Fighters might have held out a little bit longer for some better contracts, or said, no, I need to get a couple more wins before I feel confident to go to the UFC. They're not fighting now. They're looking for a job. So if you get the call last minute, say, hey, like, you want to come on Contender Series, or you want to come on a UFC show because someone fell out due to coronavirus or an injury last minute, which we've seen over the past several cards where people are being pulled left and right. You're not going to say no. And the best thing for the UFC is that they can pull a regional guy last minute to fill a slot at a 12 and 12 rate against someone that is more of an up-and-comer prospect that they feel like they could build with, say a Kevin Holland or an O'Malley. O'Malley a little bit less so, because he's got to step up now in competition with Vera. But I'm going to butcher his name, but Kazmat Chimaev, guy fought in 10 days. You know what I'm talking about. They can, just feed some bodies to these people, and they're still viewed as up-and-coming prospects that they want to boost the profile of. They can pull these regional guys in last minute and say, hey, go fight this guy. Regional guy is going to get paid more than he was on the regional scene, and he's going to be able to continue to fight. If he somehow wins, he's now in the UFC, and even if he loses, they might keep him. You never know. And at the same time, the promotion gets to pump up the guys they want. I mean, it's part of the reason. Look at how many times Roosevelt Roberts has been scheduled to fight since the pandemic. Look at Brian Kelleher. Look at some of these dudes that are getting continually booked on cards. There's a reason for that. They're lower level, they're prospects, they're still cheaper cost, but they're prospects that the UFC probably is looking at and saying, okay, maybe we can do something with this guy. And look at, the amount of fighters that have been pulled last minute from the regional scene to say, hey, you're now fighting last minute so-and-so's coach or so-and-so's. Yeah, I saw you on the regional scene. You're in the area. Cool. You get to fight. It's a win-win for the promotion. They get to bring in new names. They get to bring in Contender Series is a perfect example. They get to bring in some actual vetted names into the organization, and then they get to cut some of the guys that are journeymen that aren't living up to either the hype that the UFC wants them to, or maybe the contracts they negotiated when things were much more structured with, all these different logistics and production and all of that, because now they're pretty much either at the apex or going to do Fight Island. So that also changes the equation. So, hate to see it in some sense, especially because there are going to be probably a lot of good journeyman fighters that are going to get cut. Names you'll recognize, but it's a business move. It's not surprising White is doing that here. All right, so real quickly, I also want to touch on something that happened just, I believe, yesterday, last night, is a motion was set in place for September 17th for the UFC antitrust class action lawsuit in terms of where the judge is going to either grant class certification or deny class certification. That's a big deal. Arguments were held last summer, almost a year ago, talking about, so you had further discovery, you had arguments as to whether or not class certification could be granted, and these fighters, who include Kung Lee, John Fitch, among others, where they're essentially alleging the UFC had monopoly power, and that the two biggest points they're driving home are contracts should be limited to 1 or 2 years, regardless. You don't have these never-ending championship clauses of, hey, you've won the belts, you're automatically renewed for 4 new fights. Removing that so that fighters have some more, negotiation leverage in free agency and in between contracts, as well as, essentially having it won't be the Ali Act per se, but if it's deemed that the UFC has monopoly power, then you're looking at the potential of, the UFC losing its ability to put on shows the way it has been, and having, fighters being able to be treated purely as independent contractors. So someone could fight for the Bellator belt, and then if they won that, I'm going to go fight for the UFC belt too, and kind of leveling the playing field in terms of the way that the industry currently works. So there you're looking to a similar situation as boxing, where you'd be able to, open the floodgates for new promotions, new belts, things of that nature. And the fighter's going to be able to take, fight where they're going to get the biggest purse, honestly. So that has huge ramifications. This isn't to decide if the UFC has monopoly power or not. This is just to decide if it's a class action lawsuit or not. That does make a difference, because otherwise fighters would have to sue individually. If a class cert motion gets denied, probably kills the lawsuit, to be honest. If it gets certified, then you're looking at either the UFC taking them to court and having this all, play out in an actual trial, or maybe actually looking for some sort of, I don't know if it would be I don't know what the deal would entail, but essentially making a deal, cutting a deal with Fitch and the other fighters in order to appease them and not risk and roll the dice of what happens if they go to a lawsuit, or go to a trial. So, it's a big deal. Look for that against September 17th. I hope to be watching that live. I'm excited that we're going to hear something within a month. We've been waiting for a long time for this. It's going to be a big deal for the business of the industry, and especially for the UFC. So keep an eye on that. If you hear any news about it, or if I hear any other news about it, I will let you know. But I wanted to make sure I touched on that, because that's a pretty big deal coming up in a little bit less than a month here. So we'll see where it goes. And if you have any other questions or concerns about the lawsuit that the UFC, the fighters are leveraging against the UFC, or you just want to ask, don't quite understand it, I've got plenty of articles out there. John Nash, Paul Gift, and Jason Cruz, again, has plenty of information out there as well. Check those guys out. And I'll be happy to answer any questions. You can either leave them in the chat below or reach out to me directly, because it's a huge deal that could have massive ramifications for the sport in general. All right, guys. Last subject I want to talk about here is UFC 252 reported pay-per-view buys. Just got the numbers out fresh right before I hopped on here. Just got the report that UFC 252 did around, looks like they're estimating around 400,000 pay-per-view buys. Is that a win? I would say no, personally, and here's why. So, yes, it is better than Stipe versus DC 1. I don't know about Stipe versus DC 2 pay-per-view buys. I forget off the top of my head how they did. I think they did similar, maybe a little bit better than Stipe DC 1. But it's not a massive jump. It might be double, honestly, because I believe 226 did around 200. $100,000. So could be double that. So that's a win. But the reason it's not a win in the sense that probably the promotion wants, or what DC and Stipe were thinking, is I still very much believe we are at a pandemic bump. If you look at Gaethje versus Ferguson, if you look at Masvidal versus Usman, yes, you have some name power there. You have Masvidal especially, who kind of had that transference that I've talked about in other videos, where he beat Diaz, got his name, had the crazy KO of Askren, got some of that transference from Nate Diaz's star power, shined onto him. So he rose to another level of mainstream crossover appeal. That's all well and good, and I'd expect those numbers to be high, but Gaethje versus Ferguson is a prime example where Gaethje, when he headlined ESPN cards before the pandemic, he tended to bring in lower numbers. His ratings were some of the worst on ESPN. Not all of them were, but it was on the lower end. Ferguson only headlined a pay-per-view once, UFC 216 against Kevin Lee. That only brought in like 100 and some thousand buys. Might have been up to 200,000, but I'm pretty sure it was in the 150 range, 150,000 range, if I'm remembering correctly. So these are guys that generally don't bring in a lot of pay-per-view or viewers, under normal circumstances. All of a sudden, it skyrockets to, I think it was 800,000 buys for Gaethje versus Ferguson. Yes, it was like the first live sporting event in a long time. That was before the NBA and MLB and all these other sports had restarted. So that was huge. That was a big bump. But, there's also just not a lot of other sports on in general. Even now, there's still not a lot of other sports on in general. Another point to a COVID bump is the fact that, Bellator had their best ratings since the heavyweight tournament final between Bader and Fedor, where they were in the 400,000 range for viewers. They generally get in the 200, 300,000 range for viewership. They were up to 400,000. And that was for Chandler versus Henderson. I truly believe there's a COVID bump. And with that in mind, the fact that DC versus Stipe, which was supposed to be, for the greatest of all-time heavyweight GOAT status, only garnered 400,000, maybe 500,000, they're saying, who knows, but it looks like 400,000. The fact that that's the number you're bringing in for what was supposed to be an epic trilogy fight, the most exciting fight of heavyweight in a long time, during a pandemic, when Bellator's gotten a boost and all the other pay-per-views have gotten some sort of boost, it's not great. It's not great. So yes, those are respectable numbers. They're better than the first fight, but I think that goes to show that, hey, maybe the bump is wearing off a little bit. You do have the NBA playoffs going now. You do have MLB back. You have football looking like it's going to ramp up here shortly. NHL and is doing that as well. So, you have all that, but 400,000 buys for arguably the heavyweight GOAT trophy, not the best. Sorry, it's just not the best. All right, well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Please hit that like and subscribe button. If you watched all the way through, thank you. I really appreciate it. If you didn't and you just caught snippets, that's totally cool too. I just appreciate you guys watching. If you have any questions, you can either reach out to me on alldayauger, spelled A-U-G-E-R, on Twitter. You can, comment below the video. I make sure to read any and all comments on this. And again, we'll get some guests lined up here. It won't just be me rambling off every week. But we're toying around with a couple new ideas that I think you guys will like for the business side stuff. And yeah, like, subscribe, body lock, do all that stuff. You know what it is. And Michael is still. No, well, congrats to Michael. Actually, you know what? One real quickly here. Congrats to Michael Fidel on the launch of his website. I know he's going to kill it. He's loved to cover prospects since I met him. I'm very excited for that website. Make sure you check that out, MMAprospects.com as well. All hats off to here. He's still around here. He's still a part of the Body Lock, but he's not going to be on this show as much or some other shows. He's got a lot going on. But yeah, so don't worry. We will get some other guests in here. You won't have to just look at my, my face is amazing, so you should like it. But you get the picture. Like, subscribe, do your thing. I'll talk to you later.